Hello and welcome. My name is Victor Gijsbers and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. In this video I want to talk about a 1951 article by Max Black. And the article is called Achilles and the Tortoise, which immediately tells us that it's going to be about a famous paradox. The paradox, or one of the paradoxes, of the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno. Now, I don't want to talk about the version with Achilles and the tortoise. It is slightly more complicated. Let's just talk about the version with Achilles alone. And so, the way that Zeno sets up the paradox, he points out that if Achilles wants to run from A to B, let's say he wants to run from the beginning to the end of a race course, then Achilles will first have to pass the halfway point, right? He first has to run half of the distance. And then of the distance that he still has left, he again has to run half of that. And he will have to run half of that, and then half of that, and then half of that, and then half of that. And so we end up with Achilles having to run an infinite number of distances in order to get to the end of the racetrack. And there's some discussion about exactly how Zeno sets up the argument, but I suggest that we understand Zeno in the following way. Zeno tells us that if Achilles has to do an infinite number of things, has to finish an infinite sequence in order to get to the end of the racetrack, then that is just a logical impossibility, because you cannot finish an infinite sequence. And so, running along a racetrack, according to Zeno, is impossible, and Zeno accepts that because he believes that all movement, all change is an illusion. Now, most philosophers, not to say basically all philosophers, have refused to countenance that conclusion, have refused to say that all motion is an illusion, and so they have had to answer Zeno one way or another. They have to explain what is wrong with Zeno's paradox. Max Black, in his article, is mostly interested in showing that one particular response to Zeno doesn't work. Okay, so he's mostly interested in saying that one particular response to Zeno doesn't work, and then at the end he very briefly indicates what his own response to Zeno is. But he's mostly interested in undercutting a very famous, well-known, often given response. Here's the very famous, often given, well-known response. It is to say, oh, look, what Zeno didn't realize, or didn't want to realize, is that, yeah, sure, Achilles has to do an infinite number of things, but each of them costs only half the amount of time that the previous one did. Right? So suppose that Achilles takes 1 minute to run the first half of the racetrack, 1 minute, and let's say that he just keeps running at the same speed. Then the next half of a half, so the next quarter of a racetrack, will take him only half a minute. And then the distance after that will take him only a quarter of a minute, and then an eighth of a minute, and so on. And in the end, Achilles is going to run the entire racetrack in 1 plus 1 half plus 1 quarter plus 1 eighth, etc. That is in 2 minutes. So after 2 minutes, Achilles will have passed the end point and he will have run the entire racetrack. That's it, right? That's the story, that's the answer to the paradox. Now, here is what Max Black thinks about that. He says, look, the problem is not to calculate how much time it is going to cost Achilles to run across the racetrack, right? Because Zeno's point was never that it would take Achilles an infinite amount of time. That was not his argument. Zeno's argument was that in order to reach the end of the racetrack, Achilles will have to finish an infinite series of acts, right? He has to do the first act, run half of the racetrack, the second act, run a quarter of the racetrack, the third act, run an eighth of the racetrack, and so on. He has to finish an infinite series of acts, and it is logically impossible to finish an infinite series. Right? That's what infinity is, or means, or does. If you have an infinite series, then you cannot possibly finish it. There is no such thing as completing an infinite series of acts, or, if we think of the acts as being completed, then, and this is the way that Black formulates it, it is logically incoherent to talk about an infinite sequence of such completed acts. Right? The idea of an infinite sequence of completed acts makes no sense. So, really what Black is sort of the argument that he gets into with other commentators is whether the problems in Zeno's paradox have to do with, on the one hand, time, right? Is Zeno claiming that there's not enough time to perform all those acts? In that case, it seems very easy to defeat his paradox. Or is Zeno claiming that as a matter of logic, right, as a matter of conceptual necessity, finishing an infinite sequence is just impossible, it's incoherent? Well, then it might be not so easy, right, to get rid of Zeno's paradox, or at least you can't get rid of it by just calculating how much time it is going to cost Achilles. Or as Black says, he says, look, if we agree that Achilles reaches the end point, then of course you can calculate how much time it will take him in the way that we presented in the beginning. It's 1 minute plus half a minute, etc. We get to 2 minutes. But the very question is whether he's ever going to reach the end point, because the very question is whether movement is impossible. And it has to do with logical reasons, not with the amount of time it's going to take or anything like that. Okay, so how are we to decide who is right about this, right? About how we should think about the paradox and what the problem of the paradox is? Well, says Black, let's make some thought experiments, right? Let's make some thought experiments to find out whether this idea of an infinite completed series of acts makes sense. And in order to make that thought experiment, Black is going to introduce several machines. He introduces a whole bunch of machines. I'm just going to talk about 2 machines because I think it simplifies the situation considerably. Okay, 2 machines. Here's the first machine. This machine is going to count. And so Black first tells us something about counting. I mean, how do you count a collection of things? Well, in order to count a collection of things, basically what you're going to do is you're going to give numbers to them and put them aside until there is nothing left to count. And then the last number that you said is the number of things, right? So if somebody gives me a bunch of pens, right? A bunch of pens. Okay, here I have a bunch of pens. I'm going to count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, nothing left to count. Okay, so there were 4 pens. Well, says Black, obviously it makes no sense to ask somebody to count until there's nothing left to count if the amount of things that has to be counted is infinite. Because then there's always going to be something left to count. Right? And this is an illustration for Black of the idea that you cannot complete an infinite series of acts. There's no such thing as an infinite series of acts, all of which have been completed. Aha, says Black. But now some people come and say, no, just like Achilles on the racetrack, you definitely can do an infinite number of things as long as you do each of them twice as fast as the previous one. Right? So suppose that I have an infinite number of pens, and I take 1 minute to count the first pen, and I take half a minute to count the second pen, and I take a quarter of a minute to count the third pen, and I take an eighth of a minute to count the fourth pen, and so on. Well, this person says, then you would have counted an infinite number of pens in 2 minutes. And so here is Max Black's machine. It's a machine that counts marbles, like little round balls. And all the marbles are in a gigantic box to the left of the machine, right? A gigantic tray. And the machine is going to pick up a marble and drop it in another tray to the right. So whoop, plop, whoop, plop, whoop, plop. And it's going to do it, like it takes 1 minute to pick up and drop the first marble and return. It's going to take half a minute to pick up the second marble and return. It's going to take a quarter minute to pick up the third marble and return, and so on. And so, after 2 minutes, assuming that everything can like move as fast as we need it to. We're not going to worry about physical limitations such as the speed of light or something like that. As long as we don't have to worry about physical limitations and we're just thinking about logical conceivability, then it seems that, this makes sense, right? It makes sense to have a machine that does this, and then after 2 minutes it will have taken infinitely many marbles out of the left tray and put them into the right tray. And that's it, right? It will have completed an infinite number of acts. And so Black tells us, this is how people who think that you can sort of defeat Zeno by claiming that you can perform infinitely many things in a limited amount of time, this is how those people think, right? They think in terms of this kind of machine. Okay, says Black. But how can we be certain that there actually were an infinite number of marbles in that left tray? Right? Let's make a different machine. A machine where it is clear that the task is infinite, that the series of tasks is infinite. And there's a very easy way to do it, which is this. We take the machine we just had, and we take a second copy of that machine, which we turn around, we put them next to each other, and we put one marble in the left tray of the one machine, which is the right tray of the other machine, and one marble in the right tray of the first machine, which is the left tray of the other machine. And then we turn both of them on, right? And what's going to happen is that each of them is going to pick up their left tray marble, move it to the right tray, drop it, return. Hey, there's a new marble there, right? It's the marble that the other machine just deposited there. Pick that up, move twice as fast, drop it. Pick that up, move twice as fast, drop it. Pick that up, move twice as fast, drop it, and so on. And then at the end of 2 minutes, well, what? What is going to happen at the end of 2 minutes? Right? This machine, according to Black, has the same task as the original machine. It has to count, or pick up and drop, an infinite number of marbles. But whereas it seemed to make sense to think of the first machine that at some point it would have emptied the left tray, even though there had been infinitely many marbles in it, and transferred all of them to the right tray. In the machine we've just set up, that doesn't seem to make any sense. Right? Because emptying the left tray, well, the other machine is going to put a marble back in the left tray, and then another marble back, and then another marble back. And so there is no end state. What happens after 2 minutes? Suppose that after 2 minutes you're there and both balls are back where they started. Can they say, oh yeah, these machines finished their infinite task? No, they didn't finish their infinite task. There's still a marble left. Right? You had to go on until there was no more marble left to transfer. But there's always going to be another marble left to transfer. This, Black says, this is the right image of infinity. Right? It's something that, logically speaking, you can never reach the end of. The idea of an end state where you have finished with your infinite series of tasks makes no sense. And so what we've seen with this second machine, according to Black, is that an infinite count is impossible. An infinite series of acts is impossible. It's inconceivable. It's just not logically possible. And so Zeno was right. He wasn't right to claim that movement was impossible, but he was right to claim that Achilles cannot perform an infinite series of tasks. It just doesn't make sense to claim that somebody has finished an infinite series of tasks. Okay, so Max Black, again, as I said in the beginning, he gets into a discussion about whether this problem of infinity has something to do with time. How much time is it going to take to do these infinite many tasks? Or logic, right? Is it just logic that tells us it's impossible to finish infinity? And Max Black comes down squarely on the second side, right? He tells us that logic, with the second machine, we can see that logic tells us, or that considerations of conceivability tell us, it's impossible. Right? You cannot reach the end of an infinite sequence. So, does Max Black want to conclude that movement is impossible? No, he does not. And his own solution seems to be fairly close to Aristotle's original solution. It is to deny that Achilles has to perform an infinite series of tasks. So what Black points out is that everything in the real world seems kind of finite. Achilles makes a finite number of steps, he moves a finite number of muscles, he takes a finite number of breaths. There's just no infinity there in the physical situation. Aristotle, maybe slightly more subtly, tells us, well, there's an infinity there, but it's only potential. Right? We can think of the race course as divided into 2, or divided into 4, or divided into 8, or divided into 16. But we actually can't think of it as divided into infinity. Right? All we can do is, if we want to, divide it up mentally another time, or another time, or another time. But we never reach infinity that way. So there is, in fact, no infinite number of things that Achilles is doing. Not in fact, there's not actually an infinity that Achilles has to perform. So I'm not sure whether Black wants to claim that there really is only finite stuff or whether he wants to agree with Aristotle. It's clear that both of them claim that it's just false, that Achilles has to do infinitely many things. So they agree with Zeno that Achilles can't do infinitely many things. They disagree with him that he has to do infinitely many things. Now, in my opinion, I love this article. I love especially Black's second machine. It's such a beautiful image of what's going on in an infinite series of tasks. But I think there's one thing a little bit weak about the article, which is that Black does not explain why the second machine is the one that gives us insight into infinity. And the first machine, which seemed to count an infinite number of marbles perfectly fine, is not the correct way of thinking about infinity. And what Black tells us about this is he says, look, if one of these machines is impossible, then clearly the other machines are impossible too. But that's a bit easy. I don't think he has really shown that. He has more kind of asserted it. And it seems to me that Max Black's two machines are actually a great tool to think about two different ways of conceiving infinity. And Max Black hasn't really told us why one of those ways is better than the other. And so Max Black's first machine, the one which has infinitely many marbles over here in a tray, clearly depends on the idea of infinity as some kind of amount, right? Some kind of size. There's a certain amount of marbles, namely infinitely many, which are there. If you believe that you can think about infinity as an amount, and a lot of mathematicians do think about infinity as an amount, then that machine seems to make sense. On the other hand, Max Black's second machine thinks about infinity not so much as an amount, but as what I would like to call a form. Right? To claim that a task is infinite is to claim that it has a certain form. Well, what form? Well, in this case, it's the form of inexhaustibility, so to speak, or the form of always returning to where you already were, so that you haven't made any progress. Right? I mean, you get these two machines that transfer these marbles, and after every stage, they're just back where they're begun. Right? That's a certain form that a task can take. It has the form of inexhaustibility or of always returning back to the original position or something like that. Well, that's also a way of thinking about infinity. Right? Instead of thinking that infinite is an amount, you can think that infinite is a form that a task can take. And if we think about it that way, then the idea of finishing infinity or taking infinity as a whole indeed doesn't make any sense. So for me, Max Black's two machines are really great tools for thinking about different ways of conceiving infinity. But I'm not really seeing that Max Black's article shows us that one of these ways of conceiving infinity is the correct one or the only one. Right? Maybe they're both correct in different circumstances. Maybe one of them is correct, but then Max Black hasn't really told us, I think, well, he has told us, but he hasn't really shown us which of the two is the correct one. So, I think I will be uploading a lot more videos about infinity because I will be teaching a course on the philosophy of infinity. But here's the first one, and I hope you enjoyed it.